For this story, I'm going to keep my identity anonymous. I run a rather successful welding and metal construction company down here in Nevada, and I would prefer it if my name not be attached to any such thing. If you can respect that, you have every right to use my story for your podcast. I was driving to my workplace around 5 in the morning. I can't remember the time of the year, because this was years back, but the sun was just coming up. It was kind of in that twilight hour of the morning, where it's not quite dark, but it's not quite bright. I was almost at work, and coming across a sharp bend in the road, when as I made the turn, my headlights illuminated a figure, what I believed to be a man, standing just beyond the reaches of the road. He must have come up from the ditches below the road, but as my headlights hit him, I realized there was something wrong. While I couldn't exactly tell his skin color, or if there was anything wrong with him, he was covered in animal skins, and had these large skulls wrapped all over him. I thought it was the strangest thing I'd ever seen, and I only caught a glimpse of him for maybe a second, but it was enough to send a chill down to my stomach. As soon as I turned, I kinda had to realize for a second what I saw. Maybe a second had passed, maybe 2 since I saw him. Looking back in my rearview mirror, he was gone. There was nothing, nobody there. There's no way that that could have happened. There's nowhere for him to drop down and run without me having full view of him anywhere. I remember saying to myself, "What? What happened?" And I nearly turned my car around, just trying to figure out exactly what I saw, thinking that I was just far too tired that morning and in desperate need of more coffee. I rushed quicker to work, hoping to get another cup, and hopefully not having to deal with that again. Well, another few weeks goes by, and I'm going again in the morning. And just so you know, since I run that business, I like to show up at my work around 5 in the morning to get everything going. I want to refrain from holding out any important details about where my whereabouts are for work. And at this point, since it's been a few weeks, I had almost entirely forgotten about my little visual that happened a few weeks prior. But as soon as I get near this very same bend in the road, I see him again. Except this time, instead of standing off to the side of the road, like he was the first time, he was actually walking towards my vehicle in the very middle of the road. My headlights were full on him, and I could see much better now. He was in the exact same uniform or animal skins he had last time, and although I couldn't see his face, and he had what appeared to be human skulls draped around his body, which was disturbing enough, his eyes and face were kind of covered, although I could faintly see a red glow coming from where his eyes were. Not saying he had red eyes. I don't know what it was, but I do recall there being a faint glow, that's for sure. And as I got closer, I began to press on my brakes because, well, he was right in the middle of the road, walking, casually, towards the direction of my vehicle. I nearly halted on my brakes and rolled out my window, getting ready to scream at him, yell, "What are you doing? Why are you walking by yourself out here at 5 in the morning?" But before I can do that, before I can even come to a full stop with my vehicle, in one solid fluid motion, this man dropped down to all fours, like it was natural, and ran off with a speed unlike anything I have ever seen. He took off and veered off the road to the right, down into the sagebrush, and was gone. I just sat there with my car idling in the middle of the road, with my foot on the brake, and my mouth and jaw down into my lap. I have no idea what I saw. That entire rest of the drive to work, and I can remember that entire day at work, was hard to focus, hard to work. Even taking clients' phone calls was difficult. I do remember leaving early, and later on that afternoon, came down with a terrible flu, or what I thought was a flu. The symptoms were flu-like, and I was as sick as a dog for about 4 days afterwards, where I appeared to recover, and was just fine. Since then, I've taken that same road many times because it's really the only road that gets to my workplace. I haven't seen this mysterious man since this all happened, and I hope I don't again. I've heard legends in this area about the natives talk about skinwalkers and shapeshifters. While I always just thought it was a bunch of stories, I guess there is some truth to their tales after all. Maybe I did indeed encounter a real-life shapeshifter. Somebody who actually practices real magic and can take on the form of any animal they please. While this man didn't take on the form of an animal, the way they quickly dropped to all fours and ran off seemed so natural, just like that of an animal that normally is four-legged and quick. No human can naturally go that fast on four legs. Something was going on. After telling some of my very close friends about the story that I'm about to tell you, they tell me that I dealt with a Wendigo, but I'm not entirely too sure. So, I thought I would message somebody like you, who appears to be an expert on the subject. After all, with how many episodes of encounters and stories you have, I'm sure your knowledge is worth something. My first experience with a Wendigo was when me and my family lived in our old house. I lived in this same house from the ages of 12 to 19 before I went off to college. And I want to say the very first time, I think I was 14, and it was a very, very cold winter this year. That much I do definitely remember. I had woken up early in the morning hours of the night to go to the bathroom, which, at the time, the bathroom was right next to my bedroom, whereas my parents' room was on the opposite end of the house. Very convenient for being a teenager, you know, loud music, having privacy, etc. And for me, having my own personal bathroom, while it was still the family bathroom, but having it be right next to my bedroom was a luxurious convenience. So, after going pee, going back and laying down to bed, sometimes I have a hard time settling back into sleep, and I can be rather restless. I wouldn't be surprised if I had a little bit of insomnia, which I still think I battle to this day. But as I was trying to get nestled back into sleep, I began hearing a familiar voice, calling my name. Except there was one major thing that was wrong. It was coming from outside. The voice that was familiar was my aunt. My dad's side of the family lives on the opposite side of the country, and we don't see them much. But my mother's side, her sister, my aunt, I am very close with, even now to this day. She comes over often, and we usually go and do a lot of family stuff. And I knew there was something about it, that I knew it wasn't her. I kept hearing her voice, calling my name, calling me to come outside, and to follow her. Except the only problem is her voice sounded wrong. It sounded not right. And there was also a blizzard. At the time, we probably had at least 2 or 3 foot of snow already, and it was snowing even more. Like I said, it was a rough winter, and this was only one of the many storms we got that winter. I figured there was no way my aunt would be outside at 1:30 a.m. in the morning while a blizzard was going on. Not to mention the weird noises along with her voice. The whole thing really creeped me out, but I chalked it up to my imagination and tossed and turned and tried to ignore it the best I could. But after maybe 10-12 minutes of this voice calling my name, it began to sound closer, and then changed from my aunt's voice to my mother's voice, calling me to come outside. That's when I was even more curious. I shot up out of bed, looked out my window, and for the first time, I was able to pinpoint a shape or a figure to the voice. Standing up back by the tree was this tall, lanky figure that looked nothing like my mother. And because it was dark out, and the bare reflection of the snow, I couldn't see any details of the face or body or anything that would accurately tell me what it was I was looking at. I immediately got the creeps, and every hair on my body and head stood up out of fear. I ran back in bed, with it still calling my name, but whatever it was never came closer to the house. Soon after, I must have fallen asleep. The next morning, I heard nothing, felt nothing, and that was that for the time being. Then, this happened again, later on. I was a sophomore in high school at this point, so probably 15, 16, I want to say. Maybe it was 2 winters later, and we had another bad winter. After the very first incident, I made no mention of this to my parents because part of me assumed it was just a bad dream, or that I had maybe just heard noises out of my own sleeplessness. But this second account confirmed to me that there was indeed something. This time it was much earlier in the night. I was staying up late, maybe about 10:30 at the time, playing video games, when I heard my father's voice outside calling me, much farther away than where the first time I heard the voices come from, which was out back by the tree in our backyard. Immediately, I was brought back to the very first account that I had, and disturbing as it was, because I had already said goodnight to my father about 45 minutes prior, so I knew him and my mother were in bed together sleeping. There's no way my father could be outside my bedroom. I jumped up again after pausing my game, looking out, and due to it being snowy, not as snow as much as last time, but still snowy and cold, and no reason why my father would be out here at 10:30 at night in the snow at the very far end of my backyard. I looked but didn't see anything else this time. That alone creeped me out. So I ignored it once again, put my headphones on, put on some music, and continued playing video games. That's when, about 45 minutes after that, I began hearing tapping on my window, and hearing my father call for me from a distance. I ignored it, although I was completely terrified and shaking, not knowing what I should do. Who should I call out to? I threw my controller down, ran into my parents' bedroom, waking both of them up abruptly, and telling them, "I'm hearing voices coming from outside our window, and they sound like you, Dad." He immediately got up, runs outside to the back door, turns on the light, and looks around. There's nobody. No signs of anybody being around. He goes and checks my bedroom, opens my blinds, and sees nothing. That's when he tells me, am I sure that what I heard was what I heard? And I agree. Then I just decide to turn in early, and he tells me to keep an eye out. Well, since then, I've had other little incidents here and there, or coming home from school, or taking out the trash. I'm pretty sure I can hear my voice being called again, by either my mom or my dad, but those 2 times were the most standout ones to me, while every other time, which by the way happened quite often, were just little ones here and there, that I learned to ignore. And this happened all the way up until I left for college at 19. So this begs the question, did I encounter and deal with firsthand a Wendigo, or was this a Skinwalker? I'm not exactly sure, but it was something, and most definitely not my parents or my immediate family. With 2020 being one of the most toxic years of my life, luckily, I've been out of the job field for quite some time, but back the year prior, when I was working full-time as a ranger, I've had my fair share of some crazy stories that you probably wouldn't believe. One was that people were claiming to see a large pack of wolves roaming in and all throughout the area. Only problem is, there's no wolves in this entire state, and the pack that people were claiming to see was abnormally large, larger than any wolf pack would ever travel in. Probably around 19 to 20 wolves in total. Very, very large wolves that would come and go as they please. Sometimes they would show up in certain areas, and in another unrealistic time frame, show up in an adjacent spot not too far away. The things just weren't exactly adding up. Other people even claimed to see them as translucent or opulent. This would happen in strange spans of time. All of a sudden, people seeing these large packs come and go, and then for months, nothing. And then, these packs of wolves would come and go again. There was no real decipherable pattern. There was no rhythm to it. It was as if it was completely random. On top of that, people would go missing, and then 2 weeks later, all of a sudden show up as if they had never disappeared, having zero memory or anything of them ever being gone. The creepy thing was they had no idea that time had even passed since their disappearance, nor did they even know that they were even taken or disappeared in the first place. Many of them would even get the dates wrong when asked about what time it was or what day it was, or even the month. Just stuff like that. Things I can't quite come to a conclusion myself, because I honestly don't have a rational explanation. I've heard other stories from fellow rangers about them finding wild indigenous people, and I'm not talking like tribes of New Guinea. I'm talking like large humanoid people, covered in hair. And before you go the route of Bigfoot or Sasquatch, know that I don't think it's very possible. Not in these areas of woods, except these were tribesmen, wild people. There was even a segment of time, I want to say around 5 weeks, where the entire park was shut down for an indefinite amount of time. A choice made by our higher-ups, because apparently, about 4 or 5 people disappeared simultaneously, all around the same patch of a few days. They were never found, nor any article of clothing or any trace of them was ever discovered. And believe me, we searched high and low. I was well a part of that search expedition, and we found nothing. I've heard of other search expeditions where nothing came up, but this was my own personal expedition where I found no trace of them, which is highly unusual. Having been a part of many, there's usually always at least something that you find. Clothing, a body, remains, something. But I just can't imagine 4 to 5 people, an entire group, missing at the same time, as if they had just disappeared off the face of the planet. Things like that will keep you up at night, and make virtually zero sense as to what happened. I still dream about it sometimes, wondering where they could have gone, how they could have gotten away when they did, and where are they, if ever are they going to come back. Then, you think of the obvious. They obviously died of exposure, or perhaps found a cave somewhere and hid down in it. But when your own search dogs can't even get a scent, or they find the scent and it just abruptly ends, and then your dogs start acting weird, there's just something up. Something I don't like, and I'm not exactly quite sure what it is or what it could be. In my opinion, hands down the scariest thing I've ever heard of or seen is apparently a grizzly bear being found dead, ripped in half from the waist down, or the waist up, whichever way you prefer it. Kind of like a glass of water half empty, half full kind of deal. Something, which I don't know what does this in the wild, would not only attack a grizzly bear, but have the sheer strength to rip it in half. Not cutting, not using a tool, not sawing, none of that. Sheerly ripping this creature in half. That alone is enough to make you want to quit your job. And this grizzly bear wasn't a juvenile or an adolescent or a young pup. We're talking a fully grown adult male grizzly bear. When this bear's body was discovered, it was near a river and was freshly killed, most likely within the last 48 hours of finding it. Decay and rot had already started to set in, but it's still a very disturbing find, even for the experienced ranger. It's stories like that, along with the others that I've shared with you, that make me honestly want to stay out of this career field. And since COVID, I've not been involved. And to be honest with you, when things supposedly start back up, I think I'm going to pursue a different line of work. This just isn't keeping its flair like it used to for me. Many years ago, I had the fortunate experience as working on a ranger for 7 years at the Mammoth Cave National Park. It's also the country's largest cave system, and having generated tons of paranormal reportings, it's not surprising when you get a call that there might be screaming or somebody submerged deep in the caverns. After all, there is well more than 400 miles worth of tunnels and passages, all deep into the earth. There have also been other reports of rangers going in there after people, supposedly screaming and dying themselves, never to be seen again. I've heard of rangers even going into some of these cave systems to go after people for expeditions and never being seen again, while some report back being chased by a large unidentified predator or animal. Others have even reported seeing ghastly figures, red glowing eyes, or felt ominous, terrifying feelings, being watched, being stalked, or the worst one yet, being hunted. And unfortunately, the calls do not stop coming in. I can't tell you on a personal account how many radio calls I'd received about supposed missing persons coming from the cavern systems, or that other rangers would be by and people and campers would be complaining about screaming coming from the cave systems, as if somebody was stuck in there and couldn't find their way out. Well, you bet it's our job to go investigate, to make sure nobody's hurt. After all, there have been legitimate cases of people getting lost and trapped in there, and we've had legitimate cases where we've actually had to go and rescue them. On the contrary, though, there are those cases where we do receive calls, and we go, and there's no trace of anybody, nor sign of where the apparent screaming or noise was heard. Only ominous, evil feelings. And this isn't just you creeping yourself out or getting spooked because you're in a dark cave. I'm talking almost an electrical feeling in the air, a feeling in the pit of your stomach that tells you you are in innate danger and that you need to leave, or that something is watching you, observing you the way a cat observes a mouse right before it's about to pounce. This danger that makes the hair on the back of your neck and your forearms stand straight up. I've even talked to some of my other fellow colleagues. None of us enjoy those calls, but as the job entails, we must answer the call of duty when called. Some of the older rangers of the area truly believe there are large species of unknown animals living down in the subterranean tunnels. Me, I can't exactly say that I believe. Although I've felt the presence, I felt the ominous feelings, but I've not seen anything. Some of the older, more retired rangers have talked about seeing these beings, and that they go and traverse throughout the tunnels and go in and out of the cave systems into the forests at nighttime. They describe them all which way, from hideous reptilian-like beings to large, hairy humanoid ape creatures and everything in between. With how crazy everything is in the world right now, I guess I wouldn't put it past reality to pull that kind of trump card, no pun intended. And while the cave system has active tours and is deemed supposedly safe on many accounts, as a ranger and as somebody that works around it often, I would never step foot in there on my recreational free time. I've just dealt with it too much. It's not something I'm particularly interested in, and as a professional and friendly warning, I suggest you don't either. I just can't deem it safe. There's already been 2 missing person reports in the last year, just from that cave alone, and even more from the years prior, all following the same pattern. They disappear, no trace. When the expeditions start up, their scent is led to these cavern entrances, where the dogs won't go in any further, which I've never seen that in a search and rescue dog before, where they utterly refuse to go in any further, no matter what the circumstance or environment. It's almost as either they feel danger themselves, or the scent trail stops, and they refuse to go in any further. Something is up, and although many of us know, I feel like we're not allowed to talk about it. So, thank you so much for being a way that I can vent my struggles and stresses, and then I can actually type all this out and send it in. You wouldn't believe how many of us all feel the same way. We all see and know the same things, but due to our job, legalities, and other things, we can't say anything. We're not allowed to. But as a person to person, I would like to give you an extended warning that these parks, these national park systems, aren't all what they're cracked up to be. They're not so safe and pretty like they're painted to be. There's more things and people going missing than you could ever imagine. You wouldn't believe how much of it is kept hush-hush. And I feel there's a good reason for that. Park reputation. If the general public knew half the things that went on, or half of the missing persons that happened, well, you would probably be willing to spend a lot less money into the parks and recreation system. It's just common sense. So, if you keep the public in the dark about this, it's much easier to keep revenue flowing, and systems and structures can be maintained more easily and kept in place. After all, money is what makes the world go round, and this is no different. I hope these sets of stories find you well, and I hope you take caution. If you enjoy going into these cave systems, just be extremely careful, and always bring protective gear, plenty of lights, and never, never forget a weapon. Back when I was a little girl, I can remember this very vividly. I used to go horseback riding with my father nearly all the time, maybe every few days. My father, while not necessarily a rancher, owned large land all behind us and around us. Pasture, with more trees and more pasture, rolling hills and mountains in the distance. I was fortunate enough to grow up in a very beautiful part of the state of Colorado, a place that still holds my heart to this day. Even though I no longer live in this state, it will always be held dear to me, and my childhood was something special. But even with good childhoods can sometimes come traumatic memories. This isn't necessarily a traumatic memory, but it is a bad memory, and I can just remember how scared my dad was. To preface, my dad was a pretty hard man. He had been through, seen a lot. He was kind of like a rugged mountain man. Even rattlesnakes didn't even make him flinch. He knew how to deal with a lot of dangerous situations, and, like him, many people who were used to living off the land were kind of just like that. Hard, sturdy people. Well, his whole family was like that, so it's no wonder he's like that. And I feel like I got a lot of my emotional and mental resilience from him. Thanks, Dad. And out of all the times in my life, I think there's only maybe 2 or 3 times that I ever saw him scared. This was one of them. We were horseback riding on a trail that we had horseback rode many times before. My father would usually ride alongside me, but this particular moment on the road, he was about 2, maybe 3 feet ahead of me, when he stopped his horse abruptly, and my horse responded by stopping abruptly as well. He called out to me to be quiet, and turned his head off to the left. At the time, I didn't hear exactly what he was hearing, but he put his finger up to his mouth and motioned to shh. When I listened intently, and I could hear movement coming off from the bramble to the left. To give you a little bit better picture, to the left of us was a very thick bramble patch. If you were to get down off your horse, crawl down off the road by about 3 or 4 feet, there was blackberries everywhere. Oh, and this was in August, the perfect time for picking them, which I loved to do when I was a little girl, by the way. But at the time, I was on my horse, and didn't understand what he was listening for. But as soon as I heard the movement, I too could depict that it was coming from a large animal. Within seconds, I realized we've come across a bear, potentially a mama bear and her cubs, and figured we need to go now. But that's when the movement seemed to escalate from the distance that we both thought it was at to right up in the bramble, when it lifted its huge head out of the bramble and stared at my dad and I. It was not at all what we expected. It was not a bear, nor did it look anything like a bear. It was almost larger than a bear. Unlike bears, who stand up on 2 legs when they're curious, or maybe waddle for a short distance, this was built like a bodybuilder, just like a man. And from the upper chest all the way to the head, which as it stood up to the bramble patch was completely visible, it had the largest dog head I've ever seen in my life. Except it was much uglier. Imagine taking the face of a hyena, or maybe a German shepherd, and distorting the face. It's hard to accurately paint the picture, but it's my best idea of a description. I just remember large teeth protruding out of both its lower and upper jaws. Think like a dinosaur almost. Although this thing didn't look anything like a dinosaur, it had that same style of teeth. Overly large, razor-sharp teeth poking out of its mouth. Even its canines were protruding from its front face, and it had a very long and narrow snout, but the entire head was kind of like that of a lion. Not that it actually looked like a lion, but that it had a large kind of hairy mane on the neck and the face. But the head was very much canine. The ears were very tall and pointed. Before I sent you this email, I tried to take some own personal time, hop on Google, and see if I can find any pictures of werewolf-like creatures to give you a good depiction of something to go by. And the closest thing I could find was a mix of the movie The Howling, the werewolves in that movie, and the other werewolves from the movie Dog Soldiers. How both those creatures have this wild animal bestial look to them. How they have this thick, kind of hairy, wiry, hairy mane to them. If you need help envisioning what I'm talking about, just simply Google either of those movies, and you'll immediately know what I'm talking about. Now, I'm not saying this creature, or whatever it was, looked and resembled those two creatures exactly, but the resemblance is close enough that I can confidently use that as an accurate depiction of what it is that I saw. Upon emerging, this thing acted more surprised than we were to see it. It glanced over at me quickly, and then glanced over at my father, never once moving its head, only darting its darkened eyes over at me and then at my father, as if kind of a, "what are you guys doing here?" kind of expression on its face. It didn't appear hostile, and it didn't appear aggressive in any way, or like it was going to kill us, like I would have thought when I was young. But my father, God bless his heart, who was very protective of me, I saw the color drain from his face, and not because he was terrified, but maybe because he instinctively knew the killing power of whatever this animal was, as if he had possibly seen it before. That's the gist I got out of it. He immediately reacted, but before he could really do anything, both horses, at the sight of this thing, went nearly crazy and knocked me off the horse. I fell to the ground and actually lost consciousness for a bit. My father was also nearly knocked off the horse, but it all happened so fast. All I can remember is this sighting that lasted for a few seconds, and then the horse bucked me off, and I probably flew a few feet in the air, and then onto the ground, where I landed on my head and neck, and thank you God, I landed just right, as if to not break my neck, because I easily could have died with how I landed. The next thing I know, I'm waking up to my father holding me, crying, trying to get me to come back. He thought I was gone, but I awoke with him, holding me in his arms, telling me everything's going to be okay. Both horses were right by him. He had calmed them down. When I asked him what had happened, he just told me everything's going to be alright. Let's head home. So very calmly, we sat there for a few more moments, when I felt I was able to get up, regain somewhat strength, as if to not be too dizzy. I climbed on the horse with him, and we rode off back home, about 4 or so miles. On the ride back, it was pretty quiet. I didn't say anything or ask him anything. I think I was so busy trying to come to, trying to fight off the dizzy spells and the throbbing headache of having landed on my neck and head. When we got back, and as the day progressed, my father, something just didn't seem right. He seemed very deeply troubled, didn't speak a lot, which is unlike him, and while he's not a social butterfly, he's also not a mute. When I was finally feeling better enough to ask him about what we saw, what exactly we had encountered on that ride, he just sat me down and told me that I need to be extremely careful where I play and what it is that I'm doing outside. I told him I didn't understand, and he would never go into detail, but as I stated previously in the last paragraph, I feel that he knew what was up, that he knew something about whatever it is that we saw. His reaction just told me that this wasn't a genuine fresh reaction, that he had apparently dealt with this before. I know my father's done a lot of running around in the woods before, a lot of animal wrangling, and I know his family has too. So it wouldn't surprise me, and I wouldn't put it past him to deal with a predator like this, assuming that's what it was. At least, that's the way my father acted. He acted the same way as one time when I was younger, around 5 years old, that we did run into a mom and her cubs. It was this instinctual, he needed to protect me, and that we were in danger. It was that same fleeting feeling coming over him again. There was no mistaking it. And then the fact that my dad was acting so weird about it, wouldn't talk about it, wouldn't mention it, just kept writing it off and saying that I needed to be careful. I just couldn't help shake the fact that he knew something that I didn't. Well, he ended up dying when I was 17 years old, and as hard as that was, I've been able to take what he's taught me and learn a lot from it. I just wish he would have told me what it is that he saw that day before he finally passed, because now I'll never know. But I will never forget the memory of that encounter that day, and whatever creature the Colorado wilderness holds. Luckily, I haven't seen such an animal since then, and I hope that I don't, because I've ran into wolves, I've ran into bears, and other animals. While I'm not a mountaineer like my father, I still enjoy being out in the wilderness and enjoying what nature has to offer. But I haven't encountered that creature yet, nor will I ever truly know what it was. But part of me wonders if this animal or creature is native to this area of wilderness, or if this is something that roams around the country in certain spots. Much of my family grew up in a very small village in Brazil, where they described that they were attacked like harpy-like creatures, and also even bat gargoyle-ish-like creatures during the nighttime. Forgive me if my English isn't great, as it isn't my first language. They would always go into detail about how at nighttime, both sets of creatures would ravishly descend upon the village, taking any victims they could, killing all who were out and could not defend themselves. This usually resulted in small children, and they would apparently bring them back to their nest up in the trees of a tall mountain not far from the village. Many people of the village thought that these creatures were a curse set upon by a large underground coven of the village. Apparently, many black magic practitioners and witches would summon these beasts to do their bidding. Although it was never fully proven, they were able to arrest and capture 2 witches who claimed to be responsible for the creatures' appearances. Nothing was fully proven, nor was it ever proven that they were a part of a larger coven in conspiracy to summon these creatures to descend upon the village. The harpy creatures were described as being half human or half woman, and half eagle or bird, having large ravenous talons as feet, and large black wings for arms, with the rest of its body being exposed, including breasts and face. The eyes were like that of a serpent, and teeth like those of a jaguar, very sharp and used for ripping and tearing meat. The bat or gargoyle-like creature were also described as pitch black, halfway between a human and a bat, but much more gruesome and deadlier, having large claws at the tips of their wings and having huge black sharp talons at the end of their feet. Their eyes glowing red to be seen in the night, and having large vampire-like fangs with little rows of edges of sharp teeth. It's not certain if these creatures were from the same family or working together, but the village was pretty sure that they came from the same source, and their nests were together. One of the men of the village believed that the bat creatures lived in an upper cave in the mountains, not too far from the village, while the harpies actually lived up top the mountain, and that one of the villagers, being fed up, attempted to go there and kill them, but ended up being killed and eaten himself, while another villager apparently discovered his skull and the rest of his remains while in an attempt to rescue him, while he too perished. After about 9 or 10 years of this going on consecutively, a couple of missionaries came into the village, Catholic missionaries, and they too were driven out by these horrendous, hideous creatures, not because of what they taught or their beliefs, strictly because they were another walking sack of meat. I don't know if these creatures still plague this village to this day. The story that I'm telling you took place back in the early 60s and even into the early 70s, so it's hard to say what's going on now. But it wouldn't surprise me if these creatures are still stalking the night, ravaging any victim they can get their talons on and feast upon. This is a separate email that I wanted to send you in regards to the night creatures that I just emailed you about, the harpy creatures and the bat creatures. There was also reports, again, about the same time frame, way back in the late 60s and early 70s, from a nearby adjacent village, of seeing flying large reptiles in the sky, or dragons, as you call them. Maybe not up close, but high up in the sky, large enough, with large head, spikes and horns, and wings. No breathing fire, sorry, but they were spotted by multiple villagers, and again were suspected to be hiding and living in the mountainside, along with the harpy creatures and the bats. I don't know how much truth there is to these, along with the other encounters, but there are many villager witnesses. While these particular encounters aren't as frequent, they have been spotted. I can't say anything for modern day, but they are around, and it is rather frightening to know they exist. Back in the early spring of 2013, I was spending my time in Southern California, and at night at a friend's house, I saw this really strange sighting that I could never imagine seeing any other time in my life. But that time, I was at an all-time low, and I almost wonder if that has anything to do with my sighting of this creature, as if perhaps it was an omen. But I can confidently say, it was certainly no animal. It appeared far too intelligent. Maybe it was an omen. Maybe it was a sign that I should change my life around. Back in my friend's backyard, a ways back, is a large dead tree, and at nighttime, we were out there partying. Well, not at this particular sighting. At the time, I was completely sober, but I saw something that resembled a large bat perched up high on the top of this tree. To give you an idea of size, imagine the size of a man, huddled in the fetal position, with wings wrapped around him, and his little face or head popping out. That's what I saw. And even though it was nighttime, and there were clouds in the sky, I was still able to see enough that I can get a clear, accurate depiction of what it was that I was looking at. I saw the silhouette. There was no mistaking it. And the way the wings were folded around the body, as if it was concealing itself from all visibility, or maybe protecting itself. But the eyes were allowed to almost peer out, kind of like a bird does when it's protecting itself with its wings, but yet keeping an eye out for you. The first thing I saw were these two little red dots, and at first, I thought they were lights off in the distance. And that's when I realized those red dots were attached to something much closer, and not a plane, not a distant object. They were attached to, at the time, what I thought was an animal. Only when I studied it more, I realized maybe it was a large bat. But a large bat doesn't ever get that big. We're talking the size of a small man. So in the fetal position, it was maybe 3 or 4 feet tall. No bat gets that size. And no bat gets that size down here in Southern California. Maybe in thickly dense, oxygenated jungles of Africa or something, but not here in the US. And the way this was perched on the tree, just staring over my direction, was incredibly creepy. Although I wasn't entirely terrified, I was kind of in awe, kind of curious of what this was. I'm not gonna lie, it was very scary. I realized pretty quickly that this wasn't just an animal, and it wasn't a bat. Something instinctually told me that this was here for me. Why or what it was, I'm not quite sure, but it has stuck with me ever since I had this sighting. It never moved, it never wavered. It stayed perfectly still, like that of a statue, just watching me after maybe 2 or 3 minutes of staring back at this thing, deciding what I should do. I casually walked back inside, didn't say anything to my friends, and resumed the night as normal. The next morning, casually in the kitchen, looking out the backyard, I looked up at the same spot on the dead tree, and there was nothing there. I didn't hallucinate it. I guess I can't make that up. I saw what I saw, and there's no mistaking that there was this shape up there. This shape that distinctly looked like a bat or a man, but not Batman. I'm trying to make this serious. I just know that a bat doesn't tuck its legs in the fetal position. Only a person does that. And the way it was shaped, just everything was wrong about it. I'm terrible at describing what I saw, and I'm sorry for that. In a way, I feel like this encounter was somewhat positive, because shortly after, I did clean my life up quite a bit. Dumped my druggy girlfriend, who was bringing me down at the time, and we were in a very sour relationship, to say the least. Ditched a lot of my friends at the time, who were very bad influences, a lot of alcohol, a lot of drugs. Cleaned myself up, got on the ready and narrow path, went to school, and now I have a pretty decent job, a great wife, and I'm expecting here in the next few months. The year was about 1996, fall, when I was out hunting on a close friend of mine's property. And you might not believe this, but this is my story, and I stand firm by it. What I saw and what happened. I was tracking down what I believed to be a large 5-pointer. Long story short, made my way to a large clearing, got in a stand that I had set up long before. The stars and planets were aligned perfectly, and I had the perfect shot. As I went in to make the kill shot, I looked through my scope, and just then before I pulled the trigger, I heard the loudest screech you can ever imagine. It was almost like a deep squawk, kind of like you'd expect from a bird, but it had a higher pitched frequency distortion to it, if I'm making any sense. The deer must have heard it too, because his head immediately went up and turned in the direction facing upwards towards the sky. Before I even had a second to react, this large black flying thing swooped down and literally picked up this 5-point buck and carried it off into the trees, far beyond any visibility that I had at the time. What this thing was, I'm not sure. I want to say it was a large bird, but it was larger than me, and had very long dangly legs with large black talons at the end that it gripped onto this buck and picked it up. This wasn't a slow motion thing. This was a one quick swoop, fly down, grab the buck, and fly off. The entire thing maybe lasted 2 whole seconds. I got a view, but not a great one. Enough to see that this thing was pitch black, and the wings weren't like that of a bird, covered in feathers, and shaped parallel to the ground. These were almost bat-like. You could see the flesh, veins, and membranes in the skin. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was a large bat, or some sort of weird nocturnal creature. I don't know, but it scared me enough that day that I got down out of my stand, and I ran back. I fled from that area. If this thing was capable of picking up a 5-pointer buck, no problem. I had no idea what it would do to me, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out. You can bet I hightailed it out of there. Once I got to my friend's house, I explained to him exactly what I saw, and he knew something was up. I come barging in, pale as a ghost. He asked me what was wrong, and I told him exactly. He appeared to believe me, and even seemed worried himself. At first, he thought I was pulling his leg, joking with him, but I had to reiterate my story several times to let him know exactly where it was, and what it did. This friend of mine still hunts on that same property today. No problems, no issues whatsoever. I guess he's the brave one. knowing what I saw nearly 25 years ago and no sighting of it since. That tells me that whatever it was is probably living incognito. Either that, or lives outside the area and only comes in certain times of the year to eat and hunt. If it's that large of a predatory bird, that's terrifying. Maybe there's a reason my friend is unlucky to find good deer some years. Is it possible that this thing might have something to do with it? My aunt and uncle live pretty far out in the boonies of South Carolina. I don't even know the nearest town, but my family and I went to visit them for a couple of weeks back in 2018 for spring break. What a fun way to spend it. Yay. I was only 16 at the time. My aunt, though, is a really good cook, and so is my uncle. They make some of the best gumbo in the world and really partake in all sorts of amazing southern cuisines. Fried chicken, crawdads, brisket, the best cornbread I've ever had in my life. You name it. But my story isn't all fun and games. While part of it was, I learned of my aunt and uncle having a very dark secret and part of their lives that I wasn't aware of until this visit. Even my parents don't know. The backside of my aunt and uncle's is surrounded by thick bog for miles and miles. I don't even know how long it goes, but it's as far as the eye can see. While it's breathtaking during the morning and evening, it's not all that interesting to go around adventuring in. Maybe if you're younger, but I thought it was better to stay back in the house and play on my phone or tablet. At this point in time, we had already been there for a few nights, and I had already eaten my body weight times 2 in cornbread. At this point, I can remember vividly sitting out on the back porch, playing Candy Crush. Yes, I play that game on my phone. And I look up, and I see this strange shape heading towards the house from far off in the bog. Let me set this scene a little bit better. It's usually pitch black out here. There's 0 streetlights or any nearby roads, and their driveway is pretty long, maybe like 1/4 of a mile, and in the complete opposite direction. So out here, the only available light is either from the moon or the porch light, which at the time was off. And this night, I could see somewhat because it was clear skies, and there was enough light being given off by the moon that it kind of lit up the bog. I remember thinking to myself, is this supposedly the boogeyman coming to get me? Or is this somebody who has lost their way? It appeared to slowly move towards the house. It was far enough away that all I could really make out was its silhouette through the fog. I sat there and thought to myself, not sure what to do, or if I should go contact my aunt or uncle. It moved slowly enough, but appeared to be on 2 legs, like a person. That's when I began to suspect it was a man coming towards the house. After a couple more minutes of watching this thing creep closer and closer, still having no really definitive details, I got up, went inside, and told my aunt and uncle, "Hey guys, there's something coming towards the house from the bog. It looks like maybe a person." My aunt walks to the back porch, steps out, and tells me there's nothing here. I come out with her, and sure enough, the figure that I saw slowly wading through the bog to get up to the house was now gone. I just chalked it up to my mind. Maybe I was playing too much video games. I don't know. But my aunt and I just kind of went on with the rest of the night, and I spent it inside. I did enjoy getting fresh air outside, but I figured I'd be safer if I spent the night inside, just in case. Fast forward a couple more days, and I'm outside again. This time, it's more dusk. The sun has yet to settle, and it was nearly going over the horizon. That's when I saw the same silhouette again, coming from up the bog, but much, much closer. This time, I knew exactly what I saw, and I could actually see little bits of detail, in whoever this person was. That's when I could also see that this wasn't actually a person, but maybe some kind of animal that can also walk on two legs, that appeared to be human-like in appearance. It got closer and closer, only this time there wasn't near as much fog. This was really scaring me, because I have no idea what this was. But before I ran inside, I thought to myself, I see. This is some large elaborate prank being pulled on me by my aunt and uncle. So I jump down off the porch, and I go strolling up to this thing, which, by the way, at this point, is still several hundred feet out into the bog. But I start walking towards it, yelling, "Ha ha, very funny. Nice one. You can take the costume off now." Assuming it was either my aunt or uncle, or maybe a friend of theirs, trying to pull a prank on me and scare me. But this thing remained completely unwavered, and still kept its slow, even pace towards the house. Towards me, I think. That's when I got that feeling in my stomach. Something is wrong here. I had only maybe ran 70 feet out into the bog, and I could see this thing a little more up close. The pure sight of it alone, I realized, was not a Halloween costume. It was much more frightening. And while it wasn't what you probably think, a swamp monster or a zombie, it was neither of those things. What it appeared to be was a dead, decaying animal, like a dog or some sort of deer, except it looked like neither of those things, but more like a mixture of those things. I could tell from the distance it was at that it had large patches of missing flesh, exposed rib and bone all throughout, and what appeared to be hanging, tattered flesh from its arms. Even points on its legs and face, where it was just completely exposed bone and tissue, kind of like roadkill that was currently being eaten on by maggots. Except this had the stance of a human and appeared to walk just like a human, with the same stride pattern and holding its body up just like a man would. I knew something was wrong. I turned around, ran back to the house, got back in. That's when I ran into my aunt, who was looking at me, kind of baffled at my reaction. Her reaction to my being scared was kind of weird, but I told her, I just saw something in the bog. That's when she just smirked and said, "Did you see it?" And I asked her, "What do you mean it?" She said, "Those are my puppets." And I asked her what she meant by puppets. She proceeded to walk by the window and gave me the come hither finger. I came to her. She opened the window and showed me. It was now gone, but she told me that she has control of certain puppets that she brings into the house. I had no idea what she was talking about. She was weirding me out. Either that, or she was in on the biggest, most bizarre hoax I've ever seen or heard. I just said I needed to talk to my parents, and I began to go, and she grabbed my shirt and told me, "Not so fast." She pulled me in closer and whispered in my ear, "Can you keep a secret?" I said it depends, and she says, "Come here." Brought me to her back bedroom, and in her closet, she showed me this little shrine. She told me that for a while now, her and my uncle have been practicing the arts of summoning and black magic, casting all sorts of cantation and spells to ward off spirits and to ultimately have control over them. My aunt proceeded to tell me they've been practicing this for a while now and like to keep it a little more secret. Instead of banishing or warding off bad spirits, she prefers the dominatrix way of doing things, as she said, having complete and total control over anything and everything that comes from the bog. Then she told me about how when they first moved into the house, there were strange beings coming out of the bog up to her house to try and harm her. Strange lights, strange sightings of creatures is what she described it as. Or, she also described them as demons. She said, her and my uncle quickly got into the art and craft of doing magic learning the black magic spells to be able to control them and make them do her bidding. Now, they still come out of the bog and up to the house, but my aunt has apparent full control of what they do and, quote-unquote, who they go after. Her claim is that years back, deep in the bog, far behind the house, there was a spot supposedly designated for large occult gatherings and rituals that involved the sacrifice of living subjects, humans and animals. This was a long, long time ago, and since then, these beings have been appearing out of the bog. My aunt said your uncle and I didn't know that at first until we saw them and learned of the past around this area. Then decided to get involved and use our own power to control them and protect ourselves. I thought this whole thing was a joke, but then my aunt gave me the most serious look I've ever seen her give me in my entire life and told me it was more real than you would ever know. I was so freaked out and creeped out, I nearly ran out of the room. But as I went by her, she called my name and told me that if my parents were to somehow find out about any of this, well, I wouldn't have parents anymore at all. Safe to say, I dreaded the very last week plus of being there, keeping as far away from them as I could. My parents just assumed I wasn't feeling well and kept busy by interacting and doing stuff with my aunt and uncle. That's what I pretended, to be sick, but I didn't dare say anything, not after knowing what I did then. My parents have since gone back, but I've opted to stay at home and go where near her or my uncle. She'll sometimes call and request to talk to me personally on the phone, but I always try and opt out, saying I'm busy or I'm in the bathroom or something. I moved out earlier this year and plan to keep zero contact between us. That's how I want things to stay, for good. 3 years ago now, or so it seems, maybe 2016, I'm pretty sure I got my year right. I was a junior in high school and just got out of high school. It was roughly in the evening time, maybe 4 or 5, and so I went off into the woods, goofing around, taking selfies, and just enjoying some fresh air before heading home for the evening. This is in the state of Maryland, and as you know, Maryland isn't really big. But as I'm sitting on this log, trying to take a good selfie, I heard something large approaching me directly ahead of me. I put my cell phone down, listening, and hearing something approaching more and more. Whatever it was, I could tell was incredibly large. I was curious and stood up, getting ready to guard my ground, thinking it was probably a homeless person, and that maybe I had somehow stumbled upon their little encampment, despite there being any evidence of any homeless camps, tents, or belongings. And that's when I began to see this massive black shape appearing more and more throughout the trees. The closer it came, the more details I could see. I clearly realized this was not a person in any way, shape, or form. The closer this thing came, the more I could see this was some sort of demented animal-looking thing. Its eyes were the first thing that drew me in. They were kind of yellow and gold, and had a weird shape to them, and they stared back at me, very strangely, and I could see, through the light that I had, that this thing had horns on its head. Not like a devil, but more like a ram or a goat. It was very strange looking. Because it was so dark, the creature, not the lighting, I couldn't see every little nook and cranny of detail. But I could tell you it was dark, had very dark hair, and a very long face. It kind of just stared at me, watching me from behind a few trees, covered enough by brush that it was somewhat concealed. I've heard of stories of the Maryland Goatman before, but I always just used to think it was tales. Stories spread by kids trying to scare other kids. Or maybe just a good ghost story to get everybody spooked. And there's always folklore and legends of the land that get around. But like I said, I was never a believer. But after this experience, I can firmly say I do believe that the Maryland Goatman exists, and I saw it with my own eyes. This thing was hideous, and it was watching me. I feel like had I stayed there, I could tell it was planning on doing something. What? I don't know. But I noped out of there before I could ever give it a chance to act on it. Luckily, it didn't follow me, as I was pretty close to a road that took me back to my house. I don't go in those woods anymore. For the rest of that year, my senior year, and afterwards, I know it's around, and I do not want to give it a chance to meet me firsthand. Last summer, I was with my dad out fishing on a small pond, and as we were coming back up on shore, something charged us. Whatever this something was on 2 legs, covered in gray hair, very long hair, and kind of looked like a goat. I know that sounds weird, but that's what I saw. Luckily, I had my 9mm on me. Not enough to do much damage, but it's better than nothing. I mean, I nearly only brought my pocket knife. I'm glad at the last minute I decided against it. Now, we were coming back on shore, having been out on the pond for probably 4.5 hours at this point. As I was getting out, helping my dad out, I hear some rustling in the bushes, probably about 100 feet away from me, all the way to my left. This puzzled me and my father, because we were in an area where there shouldn't be any large animals coming through. I mean, here in Texas, you get all sorts of stuff, but this kind of commotion was too noisy. It was almost man-like or man-made, as if somebody was intentionally trying to make as much noise as they possibly could. That's when this thing charged out of the brush at my father and I, while my father getting out of the boat and I helping him out. Just out of reaction, I reached in my coat, pulled out my 9mm, fired a couple shots directly at this thing, which, by the way, was much taller than me and my father. I'm 6'2". My dad's 5'9". Don't ask me where I got my height. I think it's from my mom's side of the family. I'm pretty sure I hit this thing point blank. It was probably maybe 50 feet away from me as I fired all 3 shots. That's when it stopped and darted off in a different area of the forest, making an even more horrendous scream than when it came out. Whatever it was acted pissed. I don't know where it came from or why it decided to charge us. For all I know, it could have been sitting there in the woods surrounding the pond, watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. I don't even want to think about that. I'm very fortunate that it at least waited until we got back on shore to try and attack. Had we been in the water, and this thing could have jumped onto our boat or tried to capsize us, I don't know if we'd be here telling you the story. The main purpose in me writing you this email isn't necessarily just to tell you my story. I want to try and identify what it is that I saw. It was easily maybe 8 to 9 feet tall, and I don't think it was a Bigfoot or any other cryptid that I've heard you talk about. This thing was something else entirely. It had a very elongated face, kind of had hair that drooped down, large, sharp teeth that protruded from each end of its mouth, kind of like canines, but a little bit different, and had weird red eyes. Not like Hollywood monster glowing eyes. These were a deep red. And I'm trying to sit here and think as I type this, what kind of animal has eyes like this? No, oh well, I guess it escapes me. But the eyes weren't glowing or anything supernatural looking. They looked natural. And its head was shaped more like a stag, if that makes any sense. It also had horns protruding from the very top of its head that reminded me somewhat between a ram and a gazelle. Its lower body was more slender and lankier, where its upper body was more built, wider, and had some rippling muscles on the front part of it. It all happened so fast, so I didn't get to sit there and study it and observe every little bit of this animal. But whatever it was even though I shot it point blank 3 times. Didn't even seem to react to my bullets. It seemed to be startled by the noises of the gunshots more than anything else. I didn't see any blood, so I want to say I got it. In fact, I'm pretty sure I got it. I shot it 3 times, from about 50 feet away, but I saw no blood come from the wound, or drip down, or any sort of blood trail. So I'm not exactly sure how to explain that. That in itself is kind of a supernatural feat. After it took off, bolting off into the woods, I could hear it screaming and screaming as it ran off in a distance. It wasn't a kind of scream, like in pain. It was more like an angry scream. I don't know how to describe it. And the sound of the scream, well, if I could replay it for you, it would make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. It was something otherworldly. After it ran off, I quickly helped pull my dad out of the boat, as he's older, and him and I nearly just looked at each other, wondering, what in the hell was that thing? But we both agreed we should get our boat back onto the truck and get out of there as fast as we could, in case this thing decided to come back. Or worse, bring a couple buddies with him. So we took about 10 minutes, loading the boat back and getting everything we had back in the truck, and we took off out of there, making sure to not leave anything behind that we would need to come retrieve later on. And that would have been a mess. The area in which this whole event occurred was northeastern Texas. I hope this finds you well, and I hope you can help me properly identify exactly what this creature was. This story that I'm about to tell you occurred last year in 2019 on March 5th. I'll never forget it. I was driving outside of Louisville, Kentucky, when I saw this bizarre-looking animal walking on its hind legs across the road, dragging a dead deer. I'm not sure if the deer was already dead, roadkill, or if this thing killed it. But it seemed to pay no mind to me. I came upon it slowly, and even ended up having to halt my vehicle, pressing fully on my brakes as this thing casually strode and went across the road. It paid no attention to try and hurry and rush. It just took its time, dragging this deer. I couldn't help but watch in horror, trying to figure out what exactly I was looking at. Could this have been a person in a Halloween costume? It's not really likely. The area I was in was pretty rural, and virtually 0 communities around where I was. Well, maybe not 0 communities, but houses were pretty spread out. There would be no incentive for anybody to be out here this late at night, dragging a dead deer off into the woods, across the road. It just didn't make any sense. Because it walked so slowly, I got a very good look at it. It was covered in long, gray, strangly hair, had a very elongated face, like that of a horse or maybe a goat, except much, much uglier. It had strange eyes. They were kind of more human-like. It's hard to say, but I can clearly remember its gait and how weird it kind of hobbled around. I didn't see its lower half really as much as I did its upper half, but its posture almost reminded me of the Hunchback of Notre Dame. It had a terrible hunch in its back, and I immediately thought this creature might have scoliosis, if that's what it was. But it just had one arm behind it, dragging the deer, and paying no mind to my vehicle, looking directly ahead, and just casually pulling this deer along. As soon as it crossed the road, it disappeared into the forest, and that was that. I sat there for a minute, trying to process and fully digest what it is that I just saw. Clearly, this had to have been an elaborate prank, with a $2,000 Halloween costume. There's no way this was real. I continued driving, thinking about what I saw nonstop, and every conclusion I could come to made no sense of why a person would be doing just that. It had to have been something other than a person. An animal. But I've never seen an animal that looked like that. After a short amount of time, I gave up on putting so much mental energy and focus on it, and just contributed to another freaky thing that happened in my life. After discovering the whole scary story thing, and listening to monsters and cryptids, and knowing more now what I do than I did then, I'm almost certain I saw a GOATMAN. My teenage sons and I were camping in a dispersed site off of NF 3102 for a few days. On the morning of the 12th, just after 6 a.m., I was making coffee when I heard a guttural growling noise that rose to a higher-pitched scream and then became a whooping sound, after which it dropped back down to a growl. This sequence repeated 3 times. My dog freaked out barking, but would not go past the saplings on the east edge of the camp, which is strange because he usually pursues deer, elk, and bears several hundred yards into the woods. I grabbed my bow and walked past the line of saplings into an open forest that sloped down into a ravine with area of dense vegetation. I called my dog to follow, but he would not come. The forest in the area is full of downed trees, where my sons and I had gathered firewood the previous afternoon. I believe the sound came from the vegetation and trees at the bottom of the ravine, which we had been within 30 feet of when gathering downed wood. I only walked for about 20 feet past the saplings and stood on a log for a better view, but did not see anything moving. I then decided to go back to camp, being a bit worried because my dog wouldn't leave the area of our tent. For the next hour and a half, I sat with my bow next to me, the dog sitting on my legs, and listened to many instances of downed branches cracking beyond the saplings. When the cracks stopped, it was abruptly, not fading as if the cause were moving away. These were large branches being broken, similar to the sound of a bear breaking wood. My dog is not afraid of bears and has chased away several, including one of the previous week in eastern Idaho. About half an hour after the cracking sound stopped, the dog went out into the forest to investigate. Everything seemed to return to normal. It was then that I heard again the squirrels angrily chirping and chattering at the dog, and realized that I had not heard it at all during the noises or crackling. I have never heard anything in the Blue Mountains, Rockies, or Cascades like this sound. It sounded nothing like deer, elk, moose, bear, mountain lion, or bobcat. The only thing I could possibly think is maybe a mountain lion was killing an elk, but repeated 3 times with just the same length and cadence. And the whooping part of it reminded me of those plastic bellows hoses that you swing in the air to make a whistling whooping sound. While in Pendleton, a couple of days later, I was describing the sounds to a local hunter when an older native woman overheard, and she said she thinks it was a Bigfoot and that she's heard them on the reservation. Here's some background on me. I have spent a large part of my life in the woods between Eddington, where I grew up, and DeBlois, where my grandfather built a hunting-fishing camp in the 1920s. Everywhere in between hunting, fishing, camping, and hiking. I have walked those woods since I was 4 years old, and I'm now 61. I know the deer, moose, bear, and other wildlife of those same woods. I built my camp on Spectacle Pond in Osborne in 1988. I spent a lot of time in the years since exploring the woods and waters around the camp over the years, and know the area between Route 179 and Route 193 better than most, and within 10 miles of my camp, better than anybody. Since 2008, when I retired from the U.S. Navy, I spent 1 month every year at my camp, 2 weeks in May, fishing, and 2 weeks in November hunting. I have spent many days and nights in the most remote areas of that part of Maine. On the evening of November 12th, 2020, my wife and I had returned to our camp after an afternoon deer hunt and it was dark by the time we got back to camp and settled in for a routine evening with getting the camp warmed up, supper, a couple hands of cribbage and talking. We had been in camp for 10 days. At around 8:30, my wife decided to go to bed as we planned to hunt in the morning. I picked up my book and was reading until 10:30 at night. The only light within a half-mile of my camp was the single gas light in the front room of the camp, which I was using to read. The nearest people were a half-mile away in their camp, back toward Route 9. I decided to call it a night at 10:30, and wanted to go relieve myself before I went to bed. So I went outside across the porch, down the front steps, and walked approximately 15 feet to the back outside corner of the camp. Within seconds of standing in that spot, there was 2 very loud thwack sounds just inside the woodline, which is only 15 yards across the backyard. It took me by surprise, as I've never heard that sound made completely by itself in the woods. It sounded identical to somebody taking a large stick of firewood and hitting a tree in full swing. I could easily replicate that noise as in knocking snow, ice off firewood against a tree, but with sheer force. I did not have a flashlight with me, as the diffused light from the gas light inside the camp gave me enough point of reference to get back inside, so I didn't think to bring one with me. I stood there, perplexed as to what I had just heard, and trying to make sense of it, when it happened again, but this time a little farther away, maybe 30 yards, but still very loud. This repeated itself 10 or 11 times, over a period of 3 minutes, each time a little more distant than before. I remained standing there as I was still trying to figure out what the thwacking of these trees was. After the hitting of the trees dissipated, I returned to the camp and locked the door. I did not and still don't know what it was, but I knew it was not a person, a moose, deer, or bear. Of note, there was absolutely no light as in a flashlight from a person. Additionally, those woods are extremely thick with dead spruce and fir. Lots of blowdowns, yet there was absolutely no noise. No snapping branches, breaking twigs. Just silence. I can tell you firsthand that nobody could walk down through in there during the broad daylight, much less at night without a flashlight, without snapping branches and making a lot less noise. I spent an additional hour in camp that night, reflecting on what I had heard and trying to attribute it to something that made sense. There was none in all my experience. I went to bed, and when we got up Friday morning, we decided to hang out at camp to get a start on packing and cleaning, as we were closing up camp and leaving on Saturday. I walked into the woods during daylight, where I heard another thwack noise the night before, but found nothing where I expected to see some type of sign. Needless to say, I didn't tell my wife about those events until Saturday morning as we were getting ready to leave. I still have no idea what it was, and it was so dark. I didn't see anything, but I can tell you that I've never heard or experienced anything like that in the many years I've spent in those woods, and the 30+ years I've owned that camp. Two incidents, years apart, same woods. Background: I've been hunting in northern Florida for 30 years. I have a BS in wildlife ecology and a MS in fisheries. I am currently employed as a research biologist for a federal agency. There have been 2 incidents during these 2 hunts that I'm going to talk about that still haunt you. Mind you, I have hunted about every WMA in North Florida, spending 3 to 4 weeks a year in the woods for 35 years. For work, I have been on most of the rivers in the southeast. These 2 incidents are the only 2 where I didn't know or could not make an inference about what was occurring. Here's the first one. Around 2002, my brother suggested trying out a new location further down the river than we normally hunt. He ran me down the river in the boat and dropped me off next to a slough. Then went back upriver to go in the woods himself. This was for an afternoon hunt, so heading in the woods around 2 p.m. I walked about 250 yards away from the river, east, along the bank of the slough, until it began to curve upriver. Then found an oak to climb with my tree stand. As I sat there, I started to notice that there was nothing going on in the swamp. Normally, there is a lot of background noise and movement, birds, insects, etc. The only time that stops is when a predator moves through or a major weather shift is about to occur. But this silence just kept on. I then started to hear something between me and the river, slightly downstream of me, that sounded like squabbling raccoons, but quieter. Nothing else happened all afternoon. It was just slightly off-putting, the definition of oppressive silence. It began to get dark, and I decided that I was going to get out of there a few minutes early. Got down and started assembling my gear. Lashed the stand together, get out the headlamp and flashlight. As the sun was setting, got my stand on my back and took a few steps toward the river when, between me and the river, there was a call I have never heard before or since. A sharp, loud, piercing noise. For some reason, all I can think was, that's a 4-foot-tall parrot. It was immediately followed by a growl, big, deep, and lots of volume. I can't put enough emphasis on what the growl sounded like, or how long it rolled on for. My brain immediately went to followed by an 800-pound tiger, and then realized that's between me and the river where I need to go. By now it's dark. A deer went by me at a fast walk. I heard rapid hoofsteps, maybe only 15 yards away, and a few seconds later, I can hear the noise again, but closer. I heard no steps, wings, branches, nothing. But that call was about half the distance between me and the river. I'm still standing there, frozen. A third call, closer now. By now, I'm well past freaked out. I turn on the flashlight, headlamp, jack around into the rifle, and sort of squeak out, "Hey." Not a profound hey. I would like to think that I would have responded to that call with a throaty, "Don't mess with me." But no, I was pretty puckered up, and all my 6'2", 220 pounds can muster. I'm sweeping the woods with the flashlight and headlamp, with the rifle now loaded and safety off, and I see nothing, hear nothing. Nothing is moving, and in a few minutes, I hear the boat coming downriver and see the spotlight. As soon as I saw that, I start to hustle down the slough bank, talking loudly. Got to the river bank, jumped in the boat, and told my brother to get the hell out of Dodge. I told my brother and the other 2 folks we were hunting with, and the consensus was, yep, strange things happen in the woods, and we don't talk much about it. Here's the second one. Palmetto Bed. Maybe 5 years later, after a good morning hunt, my brother and I met up in the woods on our way back to camp for lunch. On our way, we passed near a saw palmetto clump. At this time of day, the animals, deers and hogs, have bedded down. These palmetto clumps are prime bedding sites. They are higher and drier than most of the swamp around them, and great cover. So what we do is split up. One person works wide around the outside of the clump, while the second waits a few minutes and then quietly works through the clump. The idea is that an animal would normally hold in the clump to let you go by, but will ease out if somebody is coming in, and the forward person might get a shot at them. So my brother goes in as I'm waiting outside, and in a few minutes I hear a, Mike? Come in here." I work my way in, and he's standing, looking at a 6x10 space in the middle of the clump, tiled with broken off saw palmetto fronds. Green, freshly broken off, evenly distributed to make a nice ground cover. I looked at them to verify that they were indeed snapped off. No bite marks, no tool marks. There were maybe 60 to 80 fronds, 1 layer deep, nicely spread to cover the entire area. I saw no hair. There was no smell. Just a bed of palmetto fronds laid out nicely in the middle of the clump. Now, it only takes around 10 to 15 pounds of pressure to break off a palmetto frond, but you need opposable thumbs. I looked at my brother. He looked at me. We did not say one word. Just walked out there and went back to the boat. No discussion. A few years later, he texted me to say that he had found another one of those beds in a different area altogether.